This, as just about everybody knows, is BN1, the core section of the Superheavy booster, which I got an unexpected opportunity to film because my car is still in the shop. But eventually, this is going to be the first booster, the primary booster for Starship, 70 meters high and weighing 3,700 metric tons, most of which is fuel. And even though most of us are not taking the July date that SpaceX is talking about very seriously, this is what Elon wants to see happen by July of this year. A full-fledged orbital flight of Superheavy, of Starship, of pretty much the entire package. It seems impossible. It is impossible. But this is what this ambitious and driven man is trying to accomplish from Boca Chica and not from one of his newly purchased oil platforms. To say that this is an exciting prospect would be a tremendous understatement. For Superheavy BN3, because by the way, BN1 is not supposed to fly at all, it's just going to be there for fuel pressure tests and perhaps load-bearing requirements, that sort of thing. So we're talking about BN2 flying and being tested, and then BN3 carrying Starship SN20 all the way to space. Probably not landing as we're seeing here. I think the primary objective is just to get Starship here, and that alone is an incredibly ambitious timeline. As I said before, pretty much impossible, but it's just the very nature of the timeline itself that gives us an indication of where Elon Musk's mindset is. He intends to get Starship to orbit as rapidly as he possibly can, come hell or high water. But on my way back from Boca, I happened to witness an all too common sight in this part of the country, a massive brush fire, which at the time of this recording has consumed over 5,000 acres of land in the South Texas area. And while watching this frightening conflagration, I have to admit, I began to wonder what would happen if something similar happened with Starship. And the reason I'm showing you old Soviet videos is because there was a time that the Soviet Union was in a similar situation, pushed to the very brink of developmental speed and effort by a competitive environment where they had to either fly their super rocket or face complete and utter failure. And so, with a rocket that sported as many engines or more as Superheavy, they rolled the dice and lost. Could something like this happen with Starship? Well, we're gonna find out in just a few minutes. Good morning, and welcome to another episode of the Angry Astronaut. So, got some sunglasses back finally. Definitely needed to get that trademark back on the channel, at least from my point of view. Sorry to all the folks who think that I look better the other way, but this is kind of the way I've been for a very long time, and probably going to stay this way, but not all the time, of course. Anyway, enough about that. I need to say something very quickly, and that is my position on Starship, the Super Heavy, SpaceX, all of those things. I do not believe that Starship or the Super Heavy represents any kind of huge, massive threat to the community or anything along those lines. I'm not somebody who's sounding the alarm like certain people that think that an exploding Starship would be the equivalent of an exploding tactical nuclear weapon. Actually, some people have said that it would be 3 times as powerful as Hiroshima or something like that. I'm not saying anything along those lines. However, I think it would be foolhardy for us not to go back in history and look at the only other example of a rocket that we have that has this many engines and was being developed under this kind of sense of urgency that we're seeing from Elon right now to try to achieve orbit by July. I mean, that's what, 4 months away. Just the philosophy, the idea that we want to launch by July or SpaceX, whatever, we being SpaceX and fans of SpaceX, and I count myself, amongst those, the very notion, the very philosophy of trying to achieve orbit by July is, in my opinion, a dangerous one because it suggests that we are continuing to push it until it breaks philosophy with a fully fueled Super Heavy and a fully fueled Starship stacked on the pad and trying to achieve orbit. And I feel that that is potentially a great mistake. And I think that the reason that there could be a massive mistake is from the one historical example that we have of something like this. And that, of course, is the Soviet N1. Lots and lots of engines being developed under a tremendous amount of pressure and a huge sense of urgency because NASA had already beaten the Soviets to the moon. And the consequences were pretty dramatic. But at the same time, the Soviets launched the N1 from an extremely remote location, very far away from any civilians. The Starship, on the other hand, is being launched not very far away from an inhabited area, South Padre Island. And so I thought it would be a worthwhile exercise to see what would happen if the N1 explosion happened on the pad at Boca Chica. What would be the consequences to the surrounding area? It's worth it to look at it because if there are any consequences, then it's something that could cause problems for SpaceX in the future as far as governmental authorities are concerned and as far as the local community is concerned, who's been very supportive of this up to this point, but people can be very fickle, and that could turn around very rapidly if Starship appears to present any kind of threat to the community. So I want to examine what would happen if N1 blew up right at the Boca Chica launch pad. What would be the consequences to South Padre Island and the surrounding community? And we're going to do that right now. The man on the right was Sergei Korolev, who no doubt was the hero of the Soviet rocket program and their initiatives in space. And of course, the man on the left is Yuri Gagarin, a man who had tremendous respect for Mr. Korolev. But after Korolev died, an untimely death in 1966, everything for the Soviet rocket program went south. So after Korolev's death, this guy, Vasily Mishin, took over the program, and Yuri Gagarin could not have a lower opinion of just about anybody. He criticized his, quote, poor knowledge of the Soyuz spacecraft, the details of its operation, his lack of cooperation in working with the cosmonauts in flight and training activities, and so on and so on. In Yuri Gagarin's opinion, this man was solely Я понимаю по-русски плохо, очень плохо. Okay, so that's about all I know how to say in Russian, but in any event, thanks to the translator, we're pretty much getting an impression of what this man's philosophy was, and that was to test the technology in the N1 in flight, with 12 planned flights before he even put human beings on board. Now, given that the Apollo 10 mission had already orbited the moon by 1969, May of 69, he knew damn well that the Soviets had no chance of beating the United States to the moon. Instead, he just wanted to maximize the chances of this rocket reaching the moon successfully with what he had available, testing the technology in flight, just like Elon Musk. And like Starship, the N1 was an absolute monster. Together with the L3 lunar landing spacecraft, it stood 105 meters tall and weighed 2,735 metric tons fully fueled, and it had 10 million pounds of thrust required to lift the vehicle off the launch pad, which was provided by 30 rocket engines firing in unison. Granted, a few more rocket engines than Starship, but the principle is essentially the same. On February 21st, 1960, 68.7 seconds into flight, and the altitude was about 14 kilometers by the time it could no longer operate. Now granted, compared to the accomplishments of the Saturn V, this flight of the N1 was an abject failure. However, if you compare it to the flights of SN8, SN9, SN10, perhaps not so much of a failure after all. It did take off, it did achieve a rather substantial altitude before it stopped functioning, and there was reason to be optimistic. So, SN9 actually performed worse than SN8, and yet that didn't stop Elon Musk from pressing forward. What would have happened if the Russians had had an eccentric billionaire running their program and backing it, as opposed to the inflexible and conservative Soviet authorities? Nevertheless, it is this particular launch that concerns me the most, because the second launch of N1 barely achieved 200 meters before things went disastrously wrong. Bits of flaming wreckage were already falling off of the rocket within seconds of takeoff, and once it achieved 200 meters or so in height, it exploded, and Yuri Ivanchenko, the telemetry officer, broke protocol and leaped to the window to see what was going on, and then leaped back, stated. Lieutenant Colonel Komarovsky, who was a personal witness to the biggest rocket explosion in human history, said, quote, "Today I saw without exaggeration the end of the world, and not in a nightmare, but while fully awake and standing right next to it." And he wasn't the only one. Vasily Mishin, at a distance of 10 kilometers, they would not have survived if they had emerged from their bunker unprotected. Unbelievable. And keep in mind, the N1 did not carry as much fuel as Superheavy plus Starship combined, and only 15% of N1's fuel actually exploded. The remaining 85% rained down from the sky in the form of droplets. Debris from the rocket was obviously found at least 10 kilometers away from the site. A 400-kilogram gas reservoir landed on the roof of an assembly building 4 kilometers from the launch pad, and windows were shattered as far as 40 kilometers away. A main display window at the Luna Cafe in the main residential area was 35 kilometers away and shattered. And yet, interestingly enough, the escape system worked, and the capsule on top survived unscathed. So what kind of point am I trying to make here? After all, the N1 used completely different fuel, liquid kerosene and liquid oxygen. Well, okay, it has the same oxidizer, obviously, but a different type of propellant. Starship uses liquid methane, and the explosive power would be entirely different. Or would it? Well, it's kind of difficult to say from what we've observed. Obviously, I don't want to get into a chemistry debate with anybody, because I'd probably lose, but I just base my conclusions on what I observe. Look at SN9 and keep in mind all the fuel that it had left was just a little bit left in the tanks and whatever it had in its header tanks. That's it. Now let's have a look at how far the debris is traveling from this relatively small explosion. As you can see, the larger fragments, that is, the ones that we can see, are actually traveling a fairly decent distance, several hundred meters actually, given the fact that I've been to this site and I know how far these distances are in relation, say, to the tank farm, for example. So if these fragments and this debris are traveling this far from this small of an explosion, produced by such a small amount of fuel, what's it going to be like for a fully fueled Super Heavy and a fully fueled Starship, which has 50% more total fuel than N1? Well, if a launching Starship were to duplicate what N1 did, this hotel is within 10 kilometers of the launch pad. So you could possibly be looking at debris falling down on this swimming pool, for example, and all of these windows being shattered, to say nothing of Port Isabel, which also falls within the blast zone. Not that there would be a tremendous amount of damage, but nevertheless, enough to scare people. So what I'm saying is, if we don't want a duplication of the N1 incident right in the middle of a heavily populated area, or at least fairly close to a vacation resort, which would be a terrible PR event for SpaceX at the very least, and that's assuming nobody got injured, then extreme caution needs to be observed if we are going to be trying to reach orbit from Boca Chica. Which means by the time we get to this point with a fully stacked Starship and Super Heavy at Boca Chica, we need to abandon the whole philosophy of push it until it breaks, because breaking things, flying bombs this big, is something that's going to have consequences that affect a lot more than things immediately around the launch pad. N1, in my opinion, is a powerful lesson about this, one that we would be foolish to ignore. So look, I'm not trying to be an alarmist here. I think SpaceX can do a great deal to ensure the safety of the public and the people around Boca Chica, but they can't do it while they're pushing for a launch date sometime in July, or pushing to get to orbit at any cost to the exclusion of all other considerations. That is a philosophy that is not going to work and may lead to tragedy. And not only that, holding up the entire process as the FAA and other organizations begin to pay greater attention to SpaceX and what they're doing with Starship development. It is a risk that SpaceX dare not take, and I hope, for the sake of the future of humanity and the future of manned spaceflight, that things change when we get closer to this very dramatic and important point in our history. Now, once again, I'm going to go ahead and reiterate that I am not anti-Starship or anything else as anti-SpaceX. I thoroughly support this whole idea. I think that this is a brilliantly designed machine, and I think its potential of changing the future of the human species and making us into an interplanetary civilization is perhaps one of the most, well, certainly one of the most exciting things that's ever happened in the history of our species. It could transform everything as far as the future of humanity is concerned. And it is for this reason that I want to see it succeed. And I don't want to see Starship create any problems that are going to hold up its development. And if Starship, like N1, ends up hurling large pieces of debris several kilometers from the launch pad, and also shatters windows for 10 to 20 kilometers or even further from the explosion, that is going to create a tremendous problem for SpaceX. The FAA is going to put the brakes on the entire project, and it could stay in place for a very long time, to say nothing of potential lawsuits and everything else associated with it. If we have so much as a couple dozen shattered windows at South Padre Island and one piece of debris or two pieces of debris, even if they're only 10 or 20 kilograms, making their way and hitting one of the hotels or a parked car or something like that, that is going to scare the hell out of people. And you can't effectively evacuate South Padre Island, as I pointed out in the video. It's just not practical. It would be extremely expensive. It would disrupt a lot of people's lives, and they're just not going to put up with it. And I feel that if Starship is going to launch from this location and try to achieve orbit, then we're going to have to proceed with a great deal more caution than has been observed thus far, which means the whole notion of achieving orbit by July just needs to be thrown out. It can't be done in 4 months. It just can't, not without maintaining some kind of safety margin. In my opinion, it can't be done by the end of the year and maintain some kind of safety margin. Keep in mind, BN1 isn't going to fly. BN2 has yet to even be stacked, and BN2 has obviously yet to fly. We need to see how well it performs, how well it holds up under the pressure of a lot more fuel, and how well it holds up Starship. Remember, Starship fully loaded is going to be over 200 metric tons. How well is it going to be able to hold up under all of that weight? That's a lot of questions that have yet to be answered. And then, of course, what's going to happen on the first static fire? What's going to happen with everything that follows that? What is going to happen when SpaceX tries to achieve orbit for the first time? Is it going to be a glorious success, as I hope, or is it going to be a repeat of N1 with an important difference? N1 had the support of the Soviet government, a government that didn't give a damn about what happened to people in the surrounding area. This is a very, very different story in our country, and we need to bear this in mind when we're talking about things like Starship. And as I said in the video, I know that methane is different than the fuel that was used for the N1. I know this is a different situation, but still, given the explosions that we have witnessed with just a little bit of fuel left in the tanks, as I said in the video, just the fuel in the header tanks and whatever was left, and the distance that the debris has traveled after explosions like that, I can't even begin to imagine how far debris would travel and what the force of the explosion and the shock wave would be like with a fully fueled Super Heavy and a fully fueled Starship. And the only way to avoid a scenario like that is exercising a large amount of caution, or simply waiting until the floating platforms, the oil platforms, are ready to be used as a launch site, and we can put them 30 kilometers, 40 kilometers offshore and not have to worry as much about collateral damage. One or the other, extreme caution or wait until we have a safer place to launch Super Heavy. So that's just my opinion. Obviously, Elon doesn't give a damn about my opinion, and he's going to push forward. And I wish SpaceX the best. I want to see success. I do not want to see failure. However, if failure does come, and if there is a significant incident associated with this bleeding edge technology, the consequences could be quite dramatic for SpaceX and everyone who supports them, including myself. And that is why I'm saying this, because somebody has to. So until more people start talking about things like this, until these issues are addressed and taken into account as we plow forward towards propelling Super Heavy and Starship all the way up into orbit, which will be a momentous and unparalleled event in the history of human spaceflight. Until all of this comes to pass safely, I urge all of you to stay angry about space.